When did you stop standing with me? When I realized I was no longer protecting the man I believed in.
At 8:14 on a Thursday morning, Dante Morelli stepped into a private bank vault beneath Lower Manhattan, expecting to become untouchable. The feared Mafia boss was 11 signatures away from taking control of a family trust worth just over $2 billion in hotels, trucking firms, port leases, and commercial real estate spread across 3 states. The documents were legal. The money was mostly clean. The board was nervous, but prepared to approve him. Then the elevator doors opened. Federal agents did not charge in. They didn't need to. They already knew the vault code, the backup exit behind the steel shelving, the decoy convoy idling 2 blocks away, the offshore accounts hidden behind 3 shell companies, and the exact minute Dante's second phone would begin vibrating in the inner pocket of his jacket. Only one person alive should have known all of that. Luca Ferraro did for 12 years. Luca had been Dante's shadow, driver, shield, enforcer, and the only man permitted to stand behind him with a loaded gun. He had taken a knife to the shoulder outside a Queens social club. He had driven through gunfire in Newark without flinching. He knew which whiskey Dante poured when he was angry and which he poured when he was pretending not to be. Now he stood 3 feet behind him, hands empty, face calm, while Dante slowly understood the most expensive truth of his life. He had spent years fearing enemies. He should have feared the man who knew where he slept. What made Luca's betrayal so catastrophic was not emotion. It was geometry. In organizations like Dante's, the most dangerous man was never the loud rival across the table. It was the quiet insider at the center of the pattern, the one who knew the routes, the routines, the alternate phones, the safe apartments, the cash couriers, the fake invoices, the men who could be trusted, and more importantly, the men who could not. Criminal empires survived on secrecy, but secrecy only worked when somebody inside still believed silence was honorable. Luca had stopped believing that 19 days earlier. By the time Dante realized it, the damage was already irreversible. People who had never met Dante Morelli imagined his rise had been violent and chaotic. It wasn't. Violence was only the punctuation. The sentence itself was discipline. At 42, Dante ran the Morelli organization the way other men ran private equity firms. Calm voice, clean cuffs, exact numbers. No raised volume unless he intended something permanent to follow. He had inherited chaos from his father and turned it into structure. Illegal gambling was compartmentalized. Port thefts were outsourced through subcontractors. Loan collections were routed through men who never attended the same wedding twice. The legitimate side, the side that mattered now, had become dazzling. Boutique hotels in Manhattan and Miami, freight companies, construction holdings, commercial properties near 2 expanding shipping corridors. Audited, insured, taxed, admired, the trust controlled the clean empire. Dante wanted it because power with paperwork lasted longer than power with funerals. His grandmother, Teresa Morelli, controlled the final transfer. She had buried 1 husband, 1 son, 3 federal investigations, and any illusion that family loyalty could substitute for legal caution. At 79, Teresa no longer cared who felt insulted by her precautions. She cared about survival. The trust would pass to Dante only if the board believed the legitimate holdings had not been contaminated by provable racketeering exposure. If a serious federal case touched the structure before the transfer closed, the assets would freeze under protective management. That was the part nobody outside the family understood. Dante was not merely trying to become richer. He was trying to cross a border. And borders are always most dangerous when you are almost across them. Luca Ferraro had helped build that border. He and Dante were not brothers. But they had the next most binding thing. Shared knowledge that could ruin both of them. Men in their world called that loyalty. Criminologists would call it something colder: mutual compromise, credible commitment. Shared acts that made betrayal lethal. Family strengthened it. Violence sealed it. If one man talked, he didn't just expose himself. He exposed the others who had stood beside him when choices were made that could never be discussed in daylight. That was why the old code mattered. Omerta was not just silence, it was identity. Men served prison sentences under it, some died under it. The state could threaten them with decades. Their own world threatened them with disgrace, retaliation, and sometimes far worse. Every boss from Sicily to Brooklyn knew the same history. Joseph Valachi had talked, Tommaso Buscetta had talked. Rena's world had learned what happened when insiders stopped believing the code was sacred. Once core men started speaking, organizations that had looked immortal began looking administrative. Dante studied those cases the way generals study lost wars. He believed he had learned the right lesson. Never let your core men become uncertain. What he failed to understand was that uncertainty was not what destroyed loyalty. Shame did. The first crack appeared in a conference room overlooking the Hudson. And at first it barely looked like a crack at all. A compliance officer named Elena Costa had discovered irregular invoices inside a Morelli-owned logistics company. The amounts were small enough to hide in ordinary noise, but the pattern was catastrophic. Security consulting payments routed through shell vendors. Fuel surcharges that matched no actual deliveries. Maintenance contracts billed to facilities that did not exist. Elena was not law enforcement. She was not brave in the cinematic sense. She was a numbers woman who made a terrible mistake. She believed the documents pointed to fraud. She scheduled a meeting. Dante attended personally. That alone told Luca the problem was serious. Elena sat across from them in a gray suit with a yellow legal pad and the exhausted confidence of a woman who still thought procedure would protect her. She explained the inconsistencies carefully. If corrected immediately, she said, the issue could be contained before the board review. She even used the word contained as if she were helping. Dante listened without interrupting. When she finished, he asked how many people had seen the file. Elena said just 2, herself and her direct supervisor. Dante asked where the copies were. Elena frowned slightly. In the secure server and in her home working file, Dante nodded. Then he asked a question Luca had heard before and never liked. Who else do you love? Elena looked confused for half a second, then terrified. Her husband was brought in 40 minutes later. Not beaten, not bleeding, just frightened enough to make the point. Dante was careful with first demonstrations. He preferred people to imagine the rest themselves. That was usually cheaper. Luca had expected Elena to sign the non-disclosure agreement, surrender the files, and disappear into a severance package large enough to fund her silence. That was how Dante used to handle legitimate world problems when he wanted to appear civilized. Instead, Elena started crying and said she had already backed up the records with an outside lawyer. The room changed. Dante did not shout. He rarely shouted. He just went still in a way that made every other person suddenly aware of their breathing. Then he looked at Luca. Find out if she's lying. It should have ended there. It didn't. By midnight, Elena's husband was dead after a panicked guard hit him too hard during transport. An accident, Dante called it. An unfortunate escalation caused by incompetence lower in the chain. Elena disappeared into federal protection before dawn, and for the first time in 12 years. Luca went home without sitting in his car for a minute to decompress. He went straight upstairs, kissed his sleeping daughter on the forehead, and stood in the dark longer than necessary. The next morning, Dante found him in the garage beside the armored SUV. You look tired, Dante said. Rough night. We've had rougher. Yes. They had. That was part of the problem. Dante adjusted his cufflinks and glanced toward the vehicle. The board review is in 24 days. I need this cleaned up before anyone convinces themselves it's a pattern. Luca nodded once. Dante studied him. You're thinking about the husband. He wasn't supposed to die. Neither were half the men buried because they mistook hesitation for morality. It was a hard sentence. It might even have been a necessary one in the world they occupied. But then Dante added the line Luca could not stop replaying later. She talk louder now. Fear does that to civilians, not grief. Not tragedy, not a man, a civilian, a category. That was when Luca began noticing something he should have recognized much earlier. Dante no longer divided people into loyal and disloyal. Useful and dangerous, he had evolved past even that. Now he divided them into structural and disposable. And the problem with men who think that way is simple. Eventually they forget the people closest to them are made of flesh too. For the next 2 weeks, Dante became more careful and more ruthless at the same time, which was a uniquely exhausting combination. He tightened routes, changed phones, rotated drivers. Except Luca. Never Luca. He moved sensitive meetings out of Brooklyn and into private rooms above a restaurant in White Plains. He had cash shifted through vendors twice removed from the trust. He ordered a full audit of who might have touched Elena's files. 3 middle managers vanished from the company directory by Friday afternoon. One retired suddenly to Florida. Another decided to cooperate with no one and left the country. The third was found in a motel off the turnpike with a broken jaw and a new understanding of silence. All of it might still have held. Then Paolo Rizzi got picked up. Paolo was not important enough to headline the news. That made him dangerous. He supervised docks in Newark, knew which containers moved untouched, and had access to old shipping ledgers tying Morelli's subsidiaries to Ghost Cargo. When federal agents detained him on tax and fraud charges, Dante learned about it before the paperwork was public. He called Luca immediately. Bring Paolo in before he starts imagining a future. Luca found Paolo before the government could move him properly. The man was sweating, shaking, and stupid enough to think he could bargain upward. I haven't said anything, Paolo insisted in the back seat. I swear on my children. That sentence should have protected him. Instead, Dante heard it and asked how old the children were. Luca drove in silence. He already knew where this conversation was going. Dante had been cornered before, but cornered men with billions at stake became precise in new and terrible ways. The trust closing date was now 11 days away, if Paolo cooperated. Prosecutors might trace contaminated flows into the legitimate structure. Not maybe might, for Dante, that was enough. They reached the warehouse in Red Hook just after midnight. Paolo was taken upstairs. Dante waited by the loading bay, looking out toward black water and sodium orange lights. He seemed calm, almost reflective. That made Luca angrier than if he had looked monstrous. You know what the problem is with men like Paolo? Dante asked. They panic. No, they imagine the state can protect what matters to them. Luca said nothing. Dante turned. He has a son 13, I think. Luca stared at him. Dante continued as if discussing inventory. I want the boy picked up on the way to school. No bruises, no mistakes. Paolo sees him. Paolo understands. The child goes home by dinner. For a second, the city seemed to lose sound. Then Luca said, very carefully, we're doing children now. Dante held his gaze. We are preventing testimony. He's 13. He's leverage. There it was. Small, clean, final, not rage, not frenzy. Not one bad night, a principle. Luca had been present for beatings, kidnappings, extortion, even killings. He had justified each one the way men in criminal systems always do, necessary, retaliatory, contained. The state would call it evil. The street would call it business. He had learned to live inside that vocabulary because Dante, for all his coldness, had once maintained a line. Families were pressure points, yes, but the children were fired. Children turned discipline into rot. Children turned codes into excuses. Now Dante wanted a 13-year-old used as a message, because a man with access to billions had decided fear was more efficient than patience. Luca did not argue again. Arguing would have been suspicious. He just nodded once and said, I'll handle it. That sentence saved the boy's life and destroyed Dante's empire. At 3:20 that morning, Luca made the most dangerous decision of his life in a church parking lot in Staten Island. He met 2 federal prosecutors, 1 organized crime supervisor, and a marshal who did not bother pretending this was anything other than triage. They knew who he was. He knew what talking made him: infame, rat. Dead man walking if the process failed. They knew it too. That was why witness protection existed in cases like this, not because governments were merciful, but because organized crime punishes not only witnesses, but relatives, friends, anyone close enough to hurt. The marshal placed a paper cup of bad coffee on the hood of a sedan and said, "If you start, you don't get to stop halfway." Luca looked at him. "If I start, a child goes home." That was the only noble sentence spoken that night. The rest was inventory, safe apartments, cash houses, burner numbers, shell companies, the fake janitorial vendor laundering violence through maintenance budgets. Which captains answered to whom, which meetings mattered, which did not. Where Dante kept paper records when he mistrusted digital ones. Which lawyer could be frightened, which accountant could not. Which cousin would run, which cousin would brag. Then Luca gave them the thing that mattered most. The schedule for Thursday. The vault. The signatures. The final transfer. He did not do it because he suddenly believed in redemption. Men like Luca did not get clean endings. He did it because one line had finally become too shameful to cross. The next 9 days were the longest of his life. He remained at Dante's side. He opened doors for him, tested routes, checked mirrors, took calls, stood behind his chair in restaurants while Dante discussed interest rates and union pressure and hotel occupancy as if the city itself were merely another balance sheet. At times Dante was almost the man Luca had spent years admiring. Disciplined, brilliant, even generous in controlled bursts. He paid for a doorman's cancer treatment without ever revealing his name. He sent flowers to a widow whose husband had worked for a Morelli trucking company for 22 years. He corrected a board member's financial model from memory and did it so politely the man thanked him afterward. That was the maddening part. Dante was not a cartoon villain. He was a high-functioning moral disaster, which is much more dangerous. Because people can love men like that while watching them become intolerable. 3 days before the transfer, Dante became certain someone inside was leaking. It started with a missed pickup in Queens. Then a safe phone that should have remained untouched got flagged by surveillance. Then one of Paolo Rizzi's secondary stash locations turned up empty before Dante's men arrived. He gathered 6 senior men in a private dining room and looked at each of them long enough to make them regret every decision that had brought them there. "There's a breach," he said. No one spoke. Dante's eyes moved from face to face and stopped. Briefly, on Luca. Not because he suspected him. Because he trusted him most. That was the irony already sharpening its knife. One lieutenant, Carlo Bellomo, made the mistake of defending himself too early. "I've been solid with you for 15 years, Dante nodded. "Then you'll survive one more evening of uncertainty." Carlo did not. His body was found in an abandoned car 2 days later. And Luca understood the timetable had collapsed. If Dante grew more desperate, more men would die. Perhaps entire families would disappear into those blank spaces that never appeared in headlines. Only in whispered versions of events that night. Dante poured 2 glasses of whiskey in his study and handed one to Luca. It was an old ritual. He did it only when something was bothering him enough to require honesty or a performance resembling honesty. "I should have put Carlo in front of me and watched how the others breathed," Dante said. "You got your answer anyway, did I?" Luca took the glass. "You think there are more? There are always more." Dante sat back, studying the amber in his drink. "Do you know why empires fail, Luca? Because someone wants them. No. That's pressure. Pressure is ordinary." He looked up. "They fail when the men at the center stop believing the same story. For one dangerous second." Luca thought Dante knew. Then Dante smiled faintly. "That's why I keep you close. You and I have always believed the same story." Luca had stood beside shootings with less strain in his chest than that sentence caused. Because once it had been true on Thursday morning. The city was clear and sharp, the kind of expensive-looking weather that made glass towers seem honest. Teresa Morelli arrived at the bank first. She wore charcoal silk and the expression of a woman who had already seen how power ends when men overestimate their control. 2 attorneys were with her. 3 board members, 1 compliance observer. Dante arrived at 8:11, Luca at his shoulder. The vault doors opened at 8:14. At 8:15, Dante began signing. At 8:16, his second phone vibrated in his jacket. At 8:17, The elevator opened and federal agents stepped out with the confidence of men who had been invited by information too precise to doubt. Nobody screamed. Real catastrophe is usually quieter than people imagine. One attorney dropped a pen. Teresa closed her eyes once. Not in surprise, but in disappointment. Dante didn't move immediately. He just looked at the lead agent. Then at the paperwork, then very slowly at Luca. Humans can recognize betrayal before they can articulate it. Dante's face proved that. He noticed first what wasn't there. Panic, confusion, protective movement. Luca was not reaching toward him. Not adjusting position. Not clearing a path. He was simply standing still. The agent began reading charges: racketeering, conspiracy, extortion, witness tampering, fraud, obstruction. Exposure sufficient to trigger emergency review of the trust structure. $2 billion, suddenly farther away than the moon. Dante barely heard him. He kept looking at Luca. When? He asked quietly. Luca answered with equal quiet. The night you told me to take the boy. Something changed behind Dante's eyes then, not surprise. Recognition. He remembered the warehouse. The loading bay. The sentence, of course he did. The child went home. Dante said. Yes, and you came back. I wanted to see if you'd stop. Dante almost laughed, but there was no humor in it. You betrayed me for a stranger's son. Luca shook his head. No. I betrayed you because you stopped being someone I could protect. The room went silent in a completely different way. Not the silence of fear, the silence of a truth nobody could return from. Dante looked at him for a long moment, and for the first time since anyone in that room had known him. He appeared to understand that power had limits no amount of money could negotiate. He could command crews, judges, contractors, cousins, terrified executives in half the waterfront. He could not command one man's moral threshold once he had crossed it. The agents stepped closer. Dante offered no resistance. That, more than any shouting would have, unsettled Teresa, because she recognized what had just happened. Her grandson had not been defeated by the state, not really. He had been defeated by the collapse of belief at the center of his own system. The most important weapon used against him was not a wiretap, a warrant, or a gun. It was one loyal man deciding silence had become uglier than betrayal. Luca disappeared 43 hours later, not dramatically, no helicopter. No cinematic convoy racing into the desert. Witness protection for people like him was administrative, nervous, and deliberately unromantic. New identification, new routines, no phone calls that felt human. No old photographs displayed near windows. A daughter who had to learn not to answer to her own name in public. A wife who understood that survival and grief were now roommates. He would never be innocent. He knew that cooperation does not erase history. It only rearranges consequences. Dante never touched the trust. Emergency proceedings froze the transfer. Board control splintered. Civil actions followed. Criminal trials multiplied. Newspapers called it a stunning collapse. A historic federal victory, a devastating blow to organized crime and legitimate business crossover. Those phrases were accurate and somehow still too small. Because the real collapse had happened earlier in a warehouse. When a boss who wanted to protect $2 billion decided a 13-year-old was acceptable collateral, years later. One prosecutor would describe the Morelli case in a single sentence that made other attorneys nod with professional satisfaction. Core defections are structurally catastrophic. That was the clinical version. The human version was simpler. Dante Morelli lost everything the moment his bodyguard looked at him and saw not strength. Not order, not leadership, but rot defended by expensive logic. And that is the part people miss when they talk about criminal empires as if they are built only on fear. Fear is cheap. Plenty of men can inspire fear. What makes an empire endure is the willingness of people near the center to tell themselves a flattering story about what they are protecting. A family, a code, an order more honorable than chaos. A line that still exists. The day that story dies, the empire is already finished. The arrests just arrive later because, in the end, Dante was not destroyed by his enemies. his rivals, or even the government. He was destroyed by the one man who knew him closely enough to recognize the exact moment loyalty became disgrace. And once a bodyguard reaches that conclusion, he is no longer guarding your life. He is measuring what your life is worth.